Hi, everyone. Welcome to our program today with Professor Michael Berenbaum. I'm Matthew Silverman, the Executive Director of the Haberman Institute for Jewish Studies. In some of our prior lectures, we have seen how major events have transformed Judaism, such as the early rabbinic period and the formation of Christianity in the first century, to this very moment we are living in today, life during the pandemic. Now we reflect back to not too long ago to a major formative event in Jewish and world history. We will explore the impact of the Holocaust. This is especially important as we sit now on the transition from the lived history of the last survivors. Just last month, Yvonne Bronsberg-Wagner, a longtime friend of the Haberman Institute, passed away. She was a Holocaust survivor who at the age of 9 traveled to England on a Kinder transport train and later emigrated to the United States. Her life and impact were felt by many and will continue to endure for generations. May her memory be for a blessing. Thank you to the Wagner Bronsberg Family Foundation for their generosity in supporting this program. And thank you all for being here. I'm happy to have Professor Berenbaum with us today. And I now welcome Dr. Sandy Mendelson, one of our longtime board members, to introduce our speaker. Hi, Sandy.
Thank you, Matt. Welcome to this evening's talk. The Haberman Institute community, of which you are all a part, now extends well beyond the Washington, D.C. region. It's great that we have such a large crowd online tonight. We have many more learning experiences scheduled in the weeks ahead. Check our website for full details. Our Haberman Institute board appreciates the generosity of the Wagner Bronsberg Family Foundation for supporting this talk. I want to add our voice to that which Matt just said. They have done this for many years, part of our ongoing series on German Jewish heritage. It's a personal pleasure for me to welcome Dr. Michael Berenbaum to our community this evening. Dr. Berenbaum is a lecturer, scholar, writer, rabbi, and teacher, having been on the faculties of a number of universities. In his long career in Holocaust studies, he has developed exhibitions and museums, including the early formative phases of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum here in Washington. For 3 years, he was president and CEO of the Survivors of the Shoah Visual History Foundation. Michael is the author and editor of 22 books, scores of scholarly articles, and hundreds of journalistic pieces. His work in film has earned multiple recognitions, including Academy Awards. He has also served as the executive editor of the second edition of the Encyclopedia Judaica. He is currently professor of Jewish studies at the American Jewish University in Los Angeles and the director of the Siggy Ziering Institute, exploring the ethical and religious implications of the Holocaust. I checked Michael's CV online today to make sure not to miss anything important. I did discover a significant omission, his distinction that at age 9 or maybe 10, he learned how to swim at Camp Ramah in Connecticut, where I was honored to serve as his swimming teacher. His topic tonight, the Holocaust and Jewish history. We are thrilled to have you with us, Mooney. The screen is yours.
First of all, it's a pleasure to be back in, at least indirectly, in Washington with many old friends. Sandy called me Mike. Sandy called me Michael today. It's probably the first time he's ever referred to me as Michael because my name at Ramah was Mooney. It's still my favorite name and my favorite persona. And he misrepresented, I don't want to disagree with him too much. He misrepresented one thing, which is it's Adina who taught me to swim, not Sandy, but he was the head of the waterfront, so he takes full and complete credit. And anybody who knows Sandy and Adina knows that Sandy gets a lot more credit has a lot more credit behind the scenes than she always gets. But we're old friends, and Sandy's brother David taught me canoeing with a meticulous thing, and it's a pleasure to be back with old friends. Let me talk a little bit about a question. And Matthew posed the question very well when he spoke of the Holocaust as having a place in Jewish history and in human history. And the question I want to deal with tonight is seemingly a technical question, but an all-important question, which, whose history is it, and what history are we writing? Years ago, when I spoke about Yom HaShoah, I pointed out that there are multiple days in which Yom HaShoah is observed. And in fact, the question became, as we were considering observing Yom HaShoah, is what date should be observed for Yom HaShoah? Should it be, for example, January 30th, 1933, when Hitler came to power? Should it be January 20th? Because on January 20th, 1942, the Wannsee Conference convened and the decision was implemented to murder the Jews by gas. 80% of the Jews who were to be killed in the Holocaust were alive on January 20th, 42. 15 months later, 80% of them were dead. Should it be November 9th, Kristallnacht? Should it be any number of dates? And we see the world has chosen as Holocaust Remembrance Day, not the Jews, but the world, January 27th, which was the liberation by Soviet troops of Auschwitz. And we Jews have chosen a day that puts it in a very particular place in Jewish history. It's the 27th of Nisan, which is essentially placing it close to the date of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, which is what secular Zionists wanted to do. Placing it in the month of Nisan, which is the month of redemption, so our redemption is somehow blemished by the Holocaust. And then doing what David Hartman has referred to as placing it in the high holy days of contemporary Jewish history, and that is the days marked by Yom HaShoah, 7 days later by Yom HaZikaron, and on the 8th day, Yom HaAtzmaut. Holocaust Memorial Day, the memorial day for the Israeli soldiers who were killed, followed by Yom HaAtzmaut, Israel's Independence Day. And remember something intriguing, Israel is one of the only countries in the world that observes Memorial Day in proximity to Independence Day. Remember our difference, we observe Memorial Day in May and July 4th on July 4th. And Israel is acutely aware, as Jews are acutely aware, of the price that is paid for independence. So that if you're ever in Israel at this point, you have enormously dramatic transformation between the somber sense, most especially years ago, when you had essentially large segments of the population who had been killed in war. You have this transformation from Memorial Day and its somberness to Independence Day and its exaltation. Historians also wrestle with the question of whose history to write. One of the earliest and most important works on the Holocaust was a book, and I understand you want a bibliography, so we will submit a bibliography at the end, was originally a 1-volume series, but a 3-volume series now called The Destruction of the European Jews by the great scholar Raoul Hilberg. And Hilberg is regarded as the dean and the conscience of Holocaust studies, really a founder of a field. But he wrote very simply, he said, this book is not about Jews, but it's about the people who murdered Jews. And that means that in one sense, he was not writing anything about Jewish history, but rather about what happened to the Jews and what the Germans, their collaborators, their enablers, their bystanders did to the Jews. His view, ironically, was underscored by a very different type of scholar, a woman by the name of Ruth Wisp, who was a Harvard Yiddishist who wrote an article in the New York Times saying, objecting to Harvard establishing a chair of Holocaust studies because she said the Holocaust is not a proud chapter in Jewish history. And consequently, it was about something that happened to the Jews, but not something that the Jews themselves experienced. Lucy Davidovich's, Raoul Hilberg's nemesis was a historian by the name of Lucy Davidovich, who wrote a book called The War Against the Jews. And Davidovich is essentially offered us something very unique and very distinct about it. She said the Germans fought 2 wars. The United States fought 1 war. And those of you who heard Anthony Blinken's, Secretary of State Anthony Blinken's speech, and if you haven't heard, look it up, on Yom HaShoah for the Holocaust Museum, will understand this in a moment. The Germans fought a racial war and a world war. And the racial war and the world war were in conflict with one another. We'll explain that in a moment. And the Americans fought a world war and accidentally ended up liberating camps. And that is, even when we speak of liberation, American troops happened upon these camps. Nobody ever set out to liberate the camps. And America, as we know, gave priority, absolute priority, to winning the war and did not do enough for the refugees or the victims when there was that possibility. Now, why do I mean that the World War and the racial war were in conflict? Let me explain that to you in a couple of instances. Hitler set out to office and told us what he was going to do in a book called Mein Kampf, established in 1924, written in 24, published in 25. He had 2 goals. One was to fight a racial war, and the other was German expansionism. And the idea was the racial war was to create Germany as the master race and get rid of the Jews from German space, from German culture, from German life, from German space. The problem with his strategy is that they were in conflict because everywhere he invaded and everywhere the Germans invaded, more and more Jews came under their control. Between 1933 and March 1938, approximately 150,000 German Jews had left Germany. And on March 1938, when Germany invaded Austria, it got 200,000 Jews, a net gain of 50,000. When it took over the Sudetenland and later Czechoslovakia, it got another 90,000 Jews in the areas of Bohemia and Moravia. It also had many Jews from Slovakia, a large number there. And by the time it invaded Poland, it had more than 2 million Jews, because remember, Poland was invaded from the west by Germany, from the east by the Soviet Union, and Poland's 3.3 million Jews were divided between German-occupied territory and Soviet-occupied territory. And consequently, as he expanded, more and more Jews came under his control. And equally important, you couldn't get rid of the Jews in those numbers because, one, nobody wanted the Jews, and getting rid of that massive number was a Herculean task, even when the decision was made to kill them. At Wannsee, for example, the identified number of Jews to be killed were 11 million, including the territories of the Soviet Union that were never captured, including the territory of Great Britain that also was never captured. And the other point about winning the conflict between the racial war and the world war is that the German armies were at their most expanded version in 1942. That's when they had essentially conquered all of Western Europe, with the exception of Great Britain, Spain, and those areas to the north of Great Britain. and all of Eastern Europe, including many territories of the Soviet Union, up to Stalingrad within sight of Moscow. And in 1942, that was the peak of the deportation of Jews. So as the military needs were expanding, the deportation of Jews was also expanding, and resources that were used for the military that were needed by the military and by the economy were also used to murder Jews. And the second time in which this came into conflict was 1944, when Germany was under attack from the east by the Soviet Union, from the west by the United States. And that's the moment when 437,402 Jews were deported on 147 trains over 54 days, primarily to Auschwitz, precisely as the German military was under their most extreme forms. And the United States did not respond to those triggers while both wars were being fought. Now, Davidovich has great concept of that there were two wars that were being fought. She does something very interesting in her book, which is she ends her description of the war against the Jews when the Jews enter the concentration camp, because she in essence says, when they enter the death camp, because she in essence says the Jewish history ends there, and one cannot write of a Jewish history within the camps themselves. Third scholar who's written a marvelous book, and this is Sam Kassos, Who Will Write Our History. He explored the archive of Emanuel Ringelblum, and you know that Emanuel Ringelblum lived in the Warsaw Ghetto, and in the Warsaw Ghetto, he got together a group of people, a diverse group of people, from scientists to poets, from rabbis to doctors, from historians to literary figures, to gather together an archive with the idea that he wanted somebody to be able to write Jewish history and write the history of what was happening, not from the perspective of the perpetrators, but from the perspective of the victims. And his book is Who Shall Write Our History? And again, there's a wonderful film, which some of you have seen, by Roberta Grossman, also based on Sam Kassos' book and on Emanuel Ringelblum's work, with the idea that we may not survive, but Jewish history will survive. And we need to compile the records in order to write the history from the perspective of the victims and not from the perspective, a la Raoul Hilberg, of those who killed the Jews. So the question becomes, and by the way, we have in Washington, the name of the group was ironically called the Oneg Shabbos. And I'm not being, I wouldn't say it in Sephardic because it was called in Ashkenazic, the Oneg Shabbos, the joy of Shabbos. And in essence, what he did was to organize these people to compile a record. He buried it in milk cans. 2 milk cans have been found. One of them is ironically found in the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. The third milk can is suspected to be on the grounds of the Chinese embassy in Warsaw. And keep in mind, because this may develop, that we now have a new means of archaeology, which is we can use thermal imaging to find things that are underground without digging. And we're trying to get right now permission from the Chinese embassy to be able to use this thermal technology in their gardens in the Warsaw itself, because the suspicion is that the third milk can is buried there, and we will have 1/3 of this record. The record, by the way, includes, for example, studies of starvation. It includes religious documents, it includes poetry, it includes diaries, it includes letters. It also includes what they knew and how they grappled with what they knew. in order to write the history of life within the Warsaw Ghetto. And the question becomes, where does it stand and what does it do? So the first question we have to ask is, whose history are we writing? And obviously, I am of the, well, not so obviously, but let me give you a very basic thing. I'm of the position that we have to write everybody's history. Namely, we have to write German history about the history of the perpetrator. More important now, ironically, because we have to go back in our society at this moment and ask the question, how does a democratic society fall apart, become an authoritarian society, and ultimately a totalitarian society? We think differently about polarization, which is an issue in our society. By the way, an issue in Israel just as well, which has now had 4 elections with no conclusion. So polarization is a very important issue. And then the fragility of the functioning of democracy becomes a very intriguing issue. So those of us who work in the field of the Holocaust go back and have to consider its origins in the failure of the Weimar Republic. And all of a sudden, we're writing more about German history, but we've also discovered something else, that it's not only German history. 15 years ago, we had a fabulous book by a historian by the name of Jan Gross, who wrote about neighbors, about how in one town in Poland, Jedwabne, the killing was not done by the Germans, but the killing was done by the Poles, who wanted to kill their neighbors because they wanted to inherit the property, the farmland, the homes, the businesses of their neighbors. So they marched the Jews, they put them in a barn, they set them on fire, and then they took over their homes, their lands, their businesses, their lives, in keeping with the admonition of the ancient prophets. Aratzachta v'gam yarashta, did you murder and then inherit? And they did that. We recently have and there's a tension now in Polish history. This is the origin of all of the tensions. You can't say in Poland without facing a civil suit, you can't say bad things about Polish participation in the murder of the Jews. And that's a fight over who's going to write Polish history. And the Israeli government was not ironically helpful in this, because there used to be an exception for scholarship in works of art when they made it into a criminal offense. And they did not notice in Israel that making it into a civil offense, they took away the protection for scholarly articles and for artistic works, including novels and art. And consequently, we have the trial of a Canadian Jewish Polish historian by the name of Jan Grabowski, who was found forced to apologize, and he's fighting it on appeal for writing the truth about someone. And again, the fight in Polish history. The same thing is true now, and there are 2 very important books about Lithuanian history, which now deal with the fact that in Lithuania, 2 out of 3 of the Jews who were killed by Lithuanians, not by Germans. And you have a book called Our People, which is a dialogue between a descendant of Lithuanian Jews and a descendant of a Lithuanian woman whose ancestors were perpetrators, whose uncle compiled the death list, going back to the sites of destruction and re-examining it. You have the same thing taking place with a woman by the name of Sylvia Foti, who examined her heroic grandfather and found that her heroic grandfather, who was a great Lithuanian nationalist with statues erected in his name, was also the man who murdered the Jews in Lithuania. And her work now is enormously controversial. Why? Because she's attacking Lithuanian history as well. We also saw the role, for example, France in the early period of time used to tell the great history of resistance. And only in the 1980s and the 1990s with the trials did it have to tell the story of collaboration. And we also saw, for example, Francois Mitterrand, the former president of France, go from being an anti-Nazi fighter to one who collaborated, deeply collaborated with the German authorities and with the Vichy France authorities. And again, you have the examination of whose history. I want to talk about how we put this into Jewish history. And I'm going to talk about a very interesting group of historians who were Yiddish historians. And they are historians who operated but wrote their primary history in Yiddish. They wrote in the immediate years after the war. And they were writing, ironically, not for a scholarly audience, but they were writing for a general audience and an audience that had lived through, either survived as refugees or had their family live through, have their family die and not live through this period of time. They were educated in a trilingual culture. Many spoke and wrote in more than 3 languages. They came alive in interwar Poland, but persisted in their work in Yiddish even as they made their homes in Israel, Paris, and New York, because they were interested in speaking to a Jewish audience in a Jewish language. And even though they were capable of moving into the other languages, and they each had books in the other language, they continued to write in Yiddish, feeling that they had to tell a Jewish story to a Jewish audience. Had post-war Poland been more hospitable to the Jewish revival, they might have remained in Poland. But each of them became, I don't want to call them exilic figures. Each of them became figures who ended up leaving their native land and their native tongues and going into other countries: France, the United States, Canada, Israel. One can't call them exile in Israel, but one can say they were taken from their native countries and their native lands. These men were people like Philip Friedman, born in 1901, the youngest, died early in 1960. Isaiah Trunk, born in 1905, died in 1981. Nachman Blumenthal, who was born in 1905 and died in 1983. Joseph Kermish, who died at 98 in the year 2005. And Mark Davinsky, who was born in 1988 and 1908 and died in 1975. These were a group of people who knew each other, worked with each other, interacted with each other. And as typical Jews, they loved each other and they fought with each other. And only we Jews know exactly what that means because they wrestled with each other. And essentially, they were committed to writing and documenting the Holocaust. And they tried to say, we're going to create a Jewish history of the Holocaust. Now, some of you are going to say, wait a minute, you got a whole bunch of Jews who are creating a Jewish history. You certainly have Israeli scholars who are creating a Jewish history. But the early generation of Jewish scholars did not necessarily want to create a total Jewish history. They wanted to create a Zionist history of the Holocaust, which did not treat with equal respect the Jews who were not Zionists and who lived in the tumultuous struggle of cultures that was Eastern European Jewry at the time. So they were reluctant to do that. And it took a later generation of American scholars, such as Sam Cassatt, who began to wrestle with the question of how do we write a Jewish history? How do we write a Jewish history of the Holocaust? These men were rooted in Jewish life. They worked for Jewish institutions. They worked in Europe for YIVO. They worked in the United States for YIVO. Some worked for Leo Beck. They worked for Yad Vashem. And they essentially were interested in understanding what was Jewish history. The most famous in the United States is Isaiah Trunk, who wrote a comprehensive study of the Jewish councils called the Judenrat under Nazi occupation. And he did that in response to Hannah Arendt's charge that had the Jews been leaderless, you would not have had between 4.5 million to 6 million Jews killed. That was Arendt's word. I'm not claiming 4.5 million Jews killed. So he wrote by looking at the various Jewish councils, and only he had the capacity with the multiple languages to be able to examine the different roles of the Jewish leadership and the different roles that they played. A man like Joseph Kermish spoke about Jewish self-help and all of the ways in which Jews helped each other during the Holocaust. And he was famous for a very important line that tells you something about Jewish history. And that is, just because Jews were powerless does not mean that they were passive. Let me repeat that because it's an important way of understanding. Just because Jews were powerless does not mean that they were passive, which means they did a variety of things. They did a variety of things to counteract their situation. Let me give you a couple of easy examples. We all know what happened on the night of Kristallnacht, the November pogroms of 1938, the blowing up of synagogues and the like. I want you to think for a moment, though, what was the transformed role of the synagogue in Germany prior to November 1938? On Monday morning, it became a place for, it became a welfare office. Throughout the day, it became Jewish schools as Jewish schools were closed to German Jews. It became a language laboratory to teach them languages for the countries in which they were going. On Tuesday evening, it might be theater. On Wednesday evening, it might be opera. On Thursday evening, it might be an orchestra concert, because Jewish artists, Jewish musicians, and Jewish actors were out of employment. Martin Buber would be holding a lecture on Jewish education there. It would become a welfare office. It would also become an immigration office. And essentially, the synagogue became this multi-purpose community center, serving a community that was essentially trying to get out and trying also to sustain the community that wanted to stay. On Friday night and Shabbat morning, it would have services. Obviously, the traditional would have services every day. But even the services were attended not only because people were wanting to pray, but because for 45 minutes or 2 hours, you were safe with each other. And also how prayer was used became dramatically different. Let me give you two simple examples. Leo Beck on 1935 for Yom Kippur composed a prayer of the Aleinu, in which he said, a translation in which he said, "We bow down before the Holy One, blessed be he, the King of Kings, but we stand erect before man." and everybody understood precisely what he was saying by using that translation. Joachim Prince, who was the rabbi who spoke just before Martin Luther King gave his great address, I Have a Dream, had his congregation, when he was prohibited from preaching, he had his congregation recite one line in the prayer book in Hebrew over and over again. Even those who barely read Hebrew understood it. The line was, "V'chol hachoshvim alai ra'a mehira hafera tzatam v'kolkel mochshvotam." All who think evil of me immediately, hafera tzatam, change their advice, kolkel mochshvotam, and destroy their thinking. And the congregation composed that into a chant, which then became an act of resistance. Another historian Mark Dvorsky, did something incredible. He comprised a medical history of Jews in the ghetto. And several examples of that show ingenuity, creativity, brilliance, and innovation. Let me give you two simple examples, and I know I'm speaking to Sandy, who is a physician. The two examples are, I don't know if anybody here knows it, but there was a medical school, a pharmacy school, and a nursing school in the Warsaw Ghetto. When they did not have the resources necessary to provide for the health of the population, they developed 3 different schools to train people to be able to do it, and these credits were ultimately recognized by the University of Warsaw for post-Holocaust accreditation. And there were physicians in the United States, in Israel, and in Poland who began their medical education and their medical practice in the Warsaw Ghetto. There is a famous physician of infectious diseases by the name of Moses Braun. And Moses Braun did something remarkable. He was head of infectious diseases, understood that if he had infectious diseases department in the Kovno ghetto, they would kill everybody in infectious disease, anybody with an infectious disease. So he created the hospital to create a place for people who were contagious and who could be contained in a medically secure way without labeling it infectious disease, and made the entire hospital, the nurses, the physicians, and even the visitors to the hospital, made them into a group that resisted the very label of Holocaust, of infectious diseases. And other doctors did studies, for example, of the effects of starvation, valid studies, medically valid studies that still work to today. What did they say? Couple of interesting elements of what they viewed the Holocaust. Number one, they viewed that there were 4 modes of resistance, 3 of them preceding armed resistance. The first mode of resistance they called symbolic resistance, which is the ability to preserve one's humanity under the most extraordinary circumstances. Symbolic resistance could be educating your children. Symbolic resistance could be prayer. Symbolic resistance could also be, and we've seen this, symbolic resistance took place in a very interesting way in the Theresienstadt ghetto, even in Auschwitz. And it's a woman's form of symbolic resistance. Women, starving women, preserved the women's culture of Central Europe by creating cookbooks in several of the camps. And that is, they would say, if tonight was Pesach, they would say, what did you make for Pesach? And they wrote down these recipes as a way of preserving their dignity, remembering when they had families, when they had tables, when they had food, when they had an occasion. And they compiled this as a record of their cookbooks in the same way that children in the Theresienstadt ghetto, drew and wrote poems. And we all know the book, I Never Saw Another Butterfly. So there was a whole range of symbolic resistance. Primo Levi calls it the man who washed his shirt every day, not because he could get it clean, but because he wanted to remind himself that once he used to put on a clean shirt every morning. The second form of resistance they described was polemical resistance. Polemical resistance was everything from pamphlets to underground publications, to graffiti, even to humor. And if you think of it, and I have to confess that I have been collecting Holocaust humor for 40 years and have never published on Holocaust humor because I was afraid to take the hit of Holocaust humor. But to give you how humor is a form of resistance, let me tell you two jokes, one unfortunately applicable to today. The first joke is a kid in the Warsaw Ghetto is asked, what would you like most of all if you were Hitler's son? And he said, to be an orphan. And we have a very wise audience, but I challenge any of you to give a better answer to that question than this 10-year-old kid gave in the Warsaw Ghetto. The second is what could describe our condition today. Four Jews get together. One Jew says, oi. The second Jew says, oi, oi. The third Jew says, oi, oi, oi. And the fourth Jew says, gentlemen, if we're going to talk politics all day, I'm leaving. And again, you think of humor as a tool, and there's a wonderful book in Israel, in America today, originally published in Israel as a doctoral dissertation called It Kept Us Alive, Humor in the Holocaust. And you all know about the way in which humor can be a recovering mode. And humor can also be a mode which slightly, for a moment, empowers you. And I'm reading a PhD dissertation on Purim spiels that were given because of the way in which, how in Jewish tradition, if you satirize on Purim when you don't know difference between Mordechai and Haman, you can use that. Plus Jewish self-help. There was a charity drive in the Kovno ghetto in the deepest of winter. Raoul Wallenberg would not have succeeded without the forgers in the glass house in Hungary. For every one of the Schutzpass that he created, they created 5 or 6 or 7. And they even learned how to dig up linoleum in order to use the ink in linoleum. And only then was there armed resistance. But again, just because the Jews were powerless does not mean that they were passive. What did they try to do? They tried to redeem Jewish honor by recognizing the many ways in which Jews struggled to remain alive under Nazi domination. And they also tried to give a sense that Jews tried to retain a spirit that enabled them to endure what they were surviving with, what they were surviving for, and to give them a sense of meaning. The most remarkable thing, though, is something very important, which is that they want to deny what became a major issue when we're creating the museum, the uniqueness of the Holocaust. They say the uniqueness of the Holocaust was not something that the Jews did, but the uniqueness of the Holocaust, full credit to that, belongs to the Germans. Meaning the uniqueness was the unprecedented, systematic state-sponsored murder of the entire Jewish people, men, women, and children, as a sustained policy of state for 6 years, and a policy of state that began with the preliminaries for an entire 12 years, and that swept the entire continent. Never before did that happen in Jewish history, and hopefully never again. But that's a German accomplishment, a Nazi accomplishment, not a Jewish accomplishment. And they wanted to see Jewish life in continuity with the life that was before. Yiddish historians avoid comparisons to the non-Jewish world. They don't ask, as others do, how was it that Soviet POWs trained as fighting military men, unburdened by family, community, could rise in massive numbers? It could die in massive numbers without resistance, but they contend that spiritual resistance was the only means of resistance available to the Jewish people. They shared a common enterprise to write what could not be written, a history of the Jews, how they lived, how they endured, what they endured, and how they sought to preserve their honor and dignity in a world determined not merely to murder them, but to dehumanize them. And the first is that they wanted to destroy the spirit before they destroyed the body. And I just last week read a very interesting book that is coming out now called Jewish Self-Hate. And my comment in reviewing the book was that internalizing the hatred directed at you destroys not only the body, but the soul. And I think that that's a very important message for Jews today, because as we are again being subject to a good deal of animus, and anti-Semitism is a different story today than in the past, the worst thing that we can have is the internalization of that animus. And in a very real respect, the Yiddish historians trying to write a Jewish history wanted to make sure that we would not do what Ruth Boyce said, which is to have a chapter of Jewish history of which we could not be proud, but to create a chapter of Jewish history in which we saw the capacity of the human spirit to endure, the capacity of the human spirit to create, the capacity of the Jewish spirit to ennoble what one rabbi called Kiddush HaChaim, the sanctification of human life, even in the shadow of overwhelming death. So let's take questions.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Berenbaum. We have a few questions coming in, and I welcome everyone to go ahead now and share more questions into the Q&A button below. We can address them live. So I'll start with the first question here. Could you comment on the role of the Defiant Requiem in the history of the Jews?
The Defiant Requiem, I hope people know the Defiant Requiem, and we should thank, among all of his many accomplishments, Stu Eisenstadt has been integral to getting the Defiant Requiem performed, and Mary Sindler of Catholic University, and has been, again, committed to recovering this. The Defiant Requiem is Verdian's Requiem Mass that is a unique combination of brilliant music and tremendous vocal needs, that was performed in Theresienstadt multiple times in a brilliantly subtle attempt by the Jews to embarrass their perpetrators. And it was a subtle form of resistance, reminding, ironically, their captors, the people who were ultimately responsible for killing them, reminding them of both the artistic and the brilliant artistic merits of the entire thing, and also the notion of the Mass. And finally, reminding them in a very peculiar way that they were, at the time that they were killing massive number of Jews, they were also worshiping a man who was Jewish. And again, sort of almost saying to them, if Jesus were alive today, he would be with us, not with you. And that was a subtle form of resistance, a form of defiance, and also it enabled the people to retain their own spirit because an artist who can remain an artist remains a greater, more whole human being, and consequently resists the spiritual disintegration, even on the edge of annihilation.
Thank you. With the last of the first person accounts nearing the people are nearing the end of their lives, what do you see as changing as we move away from first person history to second person history?
Well, you said it very well. We're now moving from living history to historical memory. Nobody's quite, the survivors have played a very unique role in our society, one that's not going to be easily replaceable. And in fact, it's going to call forth the collective participation of Jews. I want to say that I think that the greatest achievement of survivors, which puts it into Jewish history, goes back to something we all observed a couple of weeks ago. A couple of weeks ago, we told the fundamental foundational Jewish story, which is a particular story that happened to a particular people that we made universal, that formed the core of Jewish ethics, and that forms the basic narrative of freedom for anybody who's been exposed to the Hebrew Bible. Anybody who's exposed to the Hebrew Bible knows the story of what? Knows what Pharaoh is and what Mitzrayim is. They understand what we're looking for in Moses. They understand that you have to go through the sea and you must walk through the desert if you're ever going to come to the promised land. And what did we do that? We made that an appeal for ethics. Sabbath, sensitivity to the widow and the orphan, even to the slave, to the stranger. What survivors have done in this generation is to take the Holocaust story, a particular story that happened to a particular people, and transform it into a moral plea for human dignity, human decency, human activity in the wake of mass murder and genocide. And they've become the major moral teachers, the moral symbols of our generation, not seen as victims, but seen as symbols of resilience and as people who bear witness. I think this can only be compared to what the biblical generation did with the biblical story. That's not going to be replaced easily. We see some of it has to be institutions. I'm worried about institutions retaining their soul even as they continue their mission, because we're going to soon come to a generation that didn't even know the survivors. But we have to at best become witnesses to witnesses. Furthermore, we have another problem today. We had a problem 30 years ago, 20 years ago of Holocaust denial. We now have a terrible problem today of Holocaust repetition. The idea that somebody could walk into our nation's capital with a shirt on Auschwitz staff, and that there was a rumor that they had a notion of 6 MWE, 6 million wasn't enough, means that we have a desire for repetition. And again, that's something else. The Holocaust has been transformed into the negative absolute of our world today. Even the world of relativism, we don't understand. We may not understand what's good. We may not understand what's bad. We know Nazism is evil. Therefore, everything becomes compared to the Holocaust. And that's dangerous minimization, falsification, and the like. So we have a task ahead of us, which those of us who are Holocaust educators work on every day and worry about every day. And I had a student who lives in the Washington area who wrote an MBA on the principle of business is if you know that you're going to face a problem, you plan for it. She wrote an MBA about 12 years ago on how every institution understood that they were about to face a problem, but none of them were really planning for it. But we have three advantages taking place. Number one, we have the greatest record of documentation of Holocaust survivors of any experience in human history. We probably have 80,000 videos of Holocaust survivors all over the world. Secondly, we've created powerful institutions, not the least of which is the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. And furthermore, we have established, as it were, the Holocaust as a means for teaching values about democracy and pluralism, human dignity, human decency, and against being what? Perpetrators, collaborators, enablers, bystanders, and for being upstanders. And that's a major moral achievement of this generation that we have to sustain and continue, and a very important one.
Yeah, so and as part of that, you mentioned that, you know, you're worried maybe that the institutions will lose the soul of and I'm wondering if, like, you kind of got to that a little bit at the end there, I feel like, but I was wondering if you wanted to elaborate on that at all.
Well, I have a general worry about segments of Jewish life, which is, I think lots of people have jobs and fewer people have callings. I think that's a general problem in society today. And you can't replace the dedication of those who have callings with the bureaucracy and the institutionalization. And that is that I'm always worried about the soul of institutions. And it's like Potter Stewart's definition of pornography. You know, the famous story, Potter Stewart and William Douglas, Justices Stewart and Douglas had a problem. Stewart said, I don't know how to define pornography, but I know it when I see it. And therefore I had to watch all these pornographic films to be able to figure out what was pornographic and not pornographic. And Douglas said, I believe in free speech. I don't watch any of that. So one was consumed by it. I don't know what makes for the quality of soul, but I do know that I see the quality of soul in institutions, and they mean something much more substantive. And the dedication of that, the people who regard what they're doing not as a job or a task, but as a privilege and opportunity, that's what preserves the quality of soul. And survivors really in the last 30 years of their lives were the people who showed us how you do that. And those of us who lived in the presence of survivors, and that will not be a privilege for much longer, have to learn that and have to assume that task.
Yeah, thank you. The also in your answer to the previous question, you mentioned the use of words like Holocaust and genocide, and there's a couple of questions about how those are used more broadly today, and if you have any thoughts on that.
Well, let's talk about words for a moment, and let's begin. The Holocaust, in one sense, is a bad word, by which I mean, don't bear with me for another 30 seconds, and if you quote me, make sure you quote the rest of it. The Holocaust essentially is it comes from a Greek translation of the Hebrew word olah. Olah means a burnt offering offered whole, and then we don't say the last part of it, unto the Lord. And that is, the Holocaust connotes almost a quasi-religious meaning, because the victims who were burnt whole were not an offering. Their death was an abomination. And if there was a God who was on high witnessing that, at least the God I want to believe in is a God who shed tears and was broken by that. The Germans called it the final solution to the Jewish problem. And that was also euphemistic. Once you define Jews as a problem, you want a solution to a problem, or a question, you want an answer to a question. The final solution told us the truth. When you eliminate men, women, and children, you murder them, it's final. The Yiddish-speaking Jews called it the Churban. The Churban was in keeping with the destruction of the first and second temple, but this was even much larger than that on the scale of murder and the like. And the Israelis use it as Shoah, which is a whirlwind of destruction. But Holocaust and Lucy Davidovich, as we saw, called it the war against the Jews. Raul Hilberg called it the destruction of the European Jews. And genocide was a word invented by Raphael Lemkin to combine the combination of Sideh, which is murder, and Geno, which is the murder of a specific segment of the population of a genus. And he thought if you invented a word that was horrific, that might again prevent it. But we are with the word Holocaust, and we're not going to get away from it. But we have to understand that one of the reasons that people use Holocaust, because it's the equivalent of screaming. If you call something a Holocaust, it's saying, pay attention to it. It's sort of, putting triple exclamation points at the end of what you're doing. That denudes it of its specificity. And it also we have to be aware of its cheapening and the cheapening and the coarseness of language, which is a problem in our culture as well today.
Thank you. Very true. As a follow-up question, can you also define the word Shoah?
Shoah is a whirlwind of destruction. The best definition is a whirlwind of destruction.
Thank you. There's several questions here, and I'll ask them separately, but some of them are intertwined as far as the role of the U.S. during the war, and in particular, there's a question about Franklin Roosevelt and his actions during the Holocaust. And then I'll ask the second part, and if you need me to go back to it, I'll go back to it. But there's also the question of the creation of the State of Israel and how whether or not that was about international recognition for what happened, and also the fact that countries didn't want the Jews, and didn't allow Jews to come into their countries, and the U.S. being one of those countries.
Let me say that there was a great quipster a generation ago, actually 60 years ago, by the name Milton Himmelfarb. And Milton Himmelfarb is famous for two quotes. He said, the easiest way to get booed by an American Jewish audience is tell them that anti-Semitism is less severe a problem than they think it is. And his other comment, which has lasted for 60 years, is Jews earn like Episcopalians and they vote like Puerto Ricans. And that was a time when Puerto Ricans voted in a very particular way. In my field, when you say something nice about Franklin Delano Roosevelt, that is the easiest way to get booed. But having said that, let me suggest something to you, that we have to say which Roosevelt and when Roosevelt. And let me explain that to you very briefly. When Franklin Delano Roosevelt came to power in 1933, his first, second, third, fourth, and fifth priority was the economy. And America was isolationist, and whether he liked Hitler or not, his only issue was, how do I get the economy going? And consequently, the notion of the people coming in are going to take American jobs resonated throughout society. The labor unionists did not want it, the unemployment did not want them, et cetera, et cetera. Plus, the anti-Semitism that was prevalent at that point meant that there was no positive political role to be achieved by receiving refugees. So the United States stuck with its quotas. And remember, its quota of 1924 was established on the basis of 1890's census, because in the words of what happened at that point, we want to rebuild America along the racial stock of its founders. And by the way, if this resonates a little bit today, it's not accidental. When did Roosevelt act on behalf of the Jews? He acted on behalf of the Jews at two very particular moments. In 1938, he created the Evian Conference, which brought together 32 nations to act on the refugee problem. Notice it didn't say the Jewish problem. And then after Kristallnacht, after the November pogroms of 1938, he brought his ambassador home without severing diplomatic relations. What was unique about Roosevelt in 1938 was he was no longer going to face election, so he thought. And the second thing was he had political capital to spare because the economy was getting better. That's when he was pretty better to the Jews. 39, he turned away the MS St. Louis. And the reason that he didn't spend political capital there was Roosevelt knew two things in 1939 that the American people did not know. And he lied about one of them. He knew, number one, that he was going to run for a third term. And if you want to read Philip Roth's book, The Plot Against America, you'll understand how essential that was to America and to the American Jewish community. And those of you who saw the HBO series, that resonated. It could have been otherwise. And secondly, he knew that America had to prepare for war, something that was deeply and profoundly unpopular. When Jews got into trouble in 1942, the problem with Franklin Delano Roosevelt was that 1942, his first, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth, ninth, 10th, and go on, issue was the war. And the American Jewish community also felt that winning the war was all essential, and they didn't want to hamper the war effort. And remember, 1942 was the worst year in Jewish history. At the beginning of the Wannsee Conference, January 20th, 1942, 80% of the Jews who were to be murdered in the Holocaust were still alive. 15 months later, 80% of the Jews were dead. The worst year in the history of the Jewish people is 1942. What is Roosevelt's priority? Roosevelt's priority is the war. And what is the American Jewish community's priority? The American Jewish community's priority is the war. American Jews blew it. And this goes back to Blinken's thing. American Jews blew it at one moment in 42. Telegram arrives in the United States to Stephen Wise in August 1942, informing him of the final solution. He has no information of that. The telegram is written in such a way that he really can't go public. He says that there is under consideration in Hitler's headquarters a plan for the final solution to the Jewish problem, the murder of between 3.5 and 4 million Jews, and operations planned for the fall, including Zyklon B. And then it says something very interesting. Informant said to have the highest contacts in Hitler's headquarters, and his reports have generally been deemed reliable. Now, notice and those of us who live after 9/11 understand that connecting the dots is very important. The intelligence said the man is said to have highest contacts in Hitler's headquarters, not that he has highest contacts. And his reports have generally been reliable. You don't need to be a Talmud student to be able to say, what do you mean generally reliable? Always, sometimes, most times, et cetera, et cetera. Wise takes that, goes to the State Department. The State Department says, we don't know anything about it. Give us a little bit of time. Don't go public with this, and then we will come back to you. November 1938, November 1940, November 1942, they call Wise in and they say, we can confirm your darkest fear. And then the State Department screws Wise and screws the American Jewish community and makes something that is profound. Wise goes public with it because he now has confirmation from the State Department. And the State Department says we can neither confirm nor deny this report. They let him out to dry. That means that the report occurs on the 12th page of the New York Times instead of above the banner in the corner in letters. And then they arrange a meeting with President Roosevelt for December 1942. And by the way, we now know from the Vatican, from the opening of the Vatican archives, that the America did do a very important job to try to verify this, because it went to the Vatican and said, what do you know about what's happening to the Jews? And the Vatican had the best intelligence network in Europe. But we don't think of it as intelligence network because it had the priests on the ground in every country, both among the perpetrators and among the victims in every country. They reported to a neutral papal officer. And the most important things we can discover in the Vatican is what did they know and when did they know it, and the like. The Jews meet with Roosevelt in December 1942. The agreement is as follows, that the Orthodox rabbi is going to offer a 1-minute prayer because they have 30 minutes with the president. They begin the meeting and the Orthodox rabbi speaks for 5 minutes. Roosevelt then says, Stephen, you're looking mighty fine. How are you? He said, I know you're here. And then Stephen Wise makes the most terrible mistake imaginable. He doesn't ask the president, what do you know? Now, why is that such a major mistake? Because at that moment, 5 people in the room could have come out of that meeting and said, President Roosevelt told us A, B, C, D, E, F, and G. And that was when we believed the American government. And they would have had the president on the record saying what the situation of Jews was. Roosevelt talked for a while, and then he said, what do you want? And they came through with a mealy-mouthed request. Jewish leadership has to know, A, you get the president on record, and B, you need to come in with an agenda that you know exactly what you want. Don't take up the time of the president of the United States, especially when Jewish lives are at stake. Don't take up the time of the president of the United States unless you know what you damn well know what you want. When is Roosevelt next responsive to the Jews? In 1944. And he's responsive to the Jews because essentially there is a memo that is brought to him that came to Henry Morgenthau Jr., who's Secretary of the Treasury. The memo was the most explosive memo written during the war on the Jewish condition. It's called On the Acquiescence of the State Department to the Murder of European Jews, created by 3 Gentile members of his staff, John Pelly, Randolph Paul, and Josiah Du Bois. The information of that was leaked by the most famous name in the State Department, but not the name you suspect. The name of the State Department in those years was HISS, H-I-S-S, but not Alger, but by his brother Donald. And that unraveled for the Treasury Department what the State Department had been doing. They accused the State Department of not only not rescuing, but hampering rescue, of misleading the American people, of lying to the American people, et cetera, et cetera. Morgenthau takes that to the president. He receives the memo on January 13th, 1944. He takes it to the president. He condenses it. He gives it a neutral title, Personal Report to the President. Takes it to the president. The president reads it. The president doesn't need to know, but doesn't need to be informed that 1944 is what? Is the election year. And he says, what do you want? Morgenthau says, I want the refugee board, war refugee board. They meet on January 16th. By January 22nd, 1944, there is the War Refugee Board. Now, then you get into the issue of the bombing of Auschwitz, of which I edited a book, but let me just say that in 1 second. On June 11th, 1944, the cabinet of the Yishuv, led by David Ben-Gurion, decided not to request that Auschwitz be bombed. So one has to, presuming that David Ben-Gurion was not an anti-Semite, which some to the right of Ben-Gurion might not agree with me on, but let me operate that Ben-Gurion was not an anti-Semite. It could say that a non-anti-Semite on the 11th of June 1944 could say, don't bomb Auschwitz. His reasoning is we don't know enough about what's happening in Poland to have Jews request the bombing of Auschwitz, which would murder innocent Jews. July 8th, 1944, Chaim Weizmann and Moshe Shertok, who later became Moshe Sharett, second prime minister of Israel, goes to Anthony Eden with a request that Auschwitz be bombed. Two explanations are possible. One is that Weizmann was operating against instructions or without instructions. That might happen with Weizmann. It would have never happened with Sharett, with Moshe Shertok. The second explanation is that they received the document. The document is called the Auschwitz Protocols. It's the Verba Wexler report by two escapees from Auschwitz who compiled this in April and May 1944, which told exactly what was happening in Auschwitz. So it's only in July of 1944 that there is a definitive request to bomb Auschwitz. But remember that 95% of the Jews who were to be killed in the Holocaust were already dead. The end result, to give you a simple one-line explanation, is that we have to be grateful for Franklin Delano Roosevelt for getting America into the war and getting America equipped for the war. Roosevelt was only gracious to the Jews when he had political capitals to spare. And when we needed him, he was thoroughly, completely, and totally inadequate. And within his State Department, there were people who were not only inadequate, but deeply and profoundly anti-Semitic. And then the one person who was best on our cause was sidelined because of a homosexual scandal, that's Sumner Wells, and consequently couldn't operate in a very basic way. And the Jews close to Roosevelt, unlike the Jews today, were not willing to risk their career and their future on standing up to the President of the United States. They were more interested in holding power, and they were less comfortable in making a Judeo-centric statement about the Holocaust. So that gives you essentially a picture of Roosevelt. Grateful. World War II was Roosevelt's most major contribution to the American future, to the American Jewish future, to the future of the world, and nobody can take that away from him. Getting us into the world, into the war was all important. On the Jewish question, I'll give it to you in one sentence. I wrote a review of a book on Roosevelt. I said, and please quote me only in its entirety. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was the best of his generation in responding to the Holocaust, the best of his predecessors and successors in responding to genocide. But that's no compliment. But please, if you quote me, only quote the entire title.
Yeah.
Because otherwise they'll clobber me.
Yeah, no, don't worry about that. I wasn't sure if you want, you don't have to answer this question if you want to, but I wasn't sure if you wanted, there was a couple of questions about the creation of the state of Israel in sort of like in conjunction with sort of the narrative that you told with the US and in other countries.
Look, let me put it to you positively. Let me put it to you first nastily and then positively. There was a nasty statement made that every Jew found in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv was one less Jew in Paris, London, or New York. So, and secondly, the Jews, this is most important for Jewish history. The Jews made an incredible decision in the aftermath of the Shoah. They first survived. Secondly, they decided to survive as Jews. I'll tell you a story in a moment, but remember, not everybody decided to survive as Jews. Think of the Madeleine Albright story, where her family learned from the Holocaust that Jewishness is the third rail of family experience. Don't ask, don't tell, don't talk, don't engage. So she had Jewish cousins, and she's a very smart woman, but had internalized, don't deal with anything Jewish. It's the third rail of family experience. Don't go near that she never realized that her own grandparents were Jewish. The only reason somebody as bright as Madeleine Albright, she was a colleague of mine in Georgetown before she was Madeleine Albright's Secretary of State and UN ambassador. The only reason somebody can repress that information is because it's so frightening to confront. They survived as Jews. They then made themselves into a political group in the displaced persons camp, arguing for the creation of the state of Israel. Israel might have been created, let's even say would have been created without the Holocaust by the efforts of the Zionist movement, but it would have taken much, much longer. But we can't impose upon Israel being the answer to the Holocaust. Nevertheless, it is the consolation. And it's also the most incredible thing about Jewish history is after our greatest defeat in history, we reinvented ourselves. We came back with a vengeance at Jewish life. So our answer to Jewish death was to recreate Jewish life. Tell you a story. The highest birth rate in all of Europe was in the displaced persons camp. I met a man by the name of Rabbi Arnold Weider. Arnold Weider was the mole of Boston. A baseball joke because he was the mole of Boston, because Jews are uncomfortable with Brit Milah, meaning we do it, but everybody's a little bit on edge at the beginning. He had the reputation in Boston of being the Yankee Clipper, without any disrespect to Joe DiMaggio, but with a lot of disrespect to Joe DiMaggio. I asked him, where did you learn to be a mole? He said, I learned to be a mole in Bergen-Belsen. And then I heard for myself a story. For 6 years, if a Jewish man lowered his trousers, he was dead. Women were used as couriers because they weren't circumcised. Jewish men had the ultimate vulnerability. Lower your trousers, you're dead in Europe, because only Jewish men were circumcised. What did Jews do on the 7th year? Without knowing what the future would be, without knowing what the world was going to be, without knowing where they were going to live, where they were going to make their future, they dared to circumcise their sons, doubling down on Jewish life. That's one of the great miracles of Jewish history. We could have said the hell with it, but the Jews responded to death by recreating life, responded to the most vicious anti-Semitism we've ever known by recreating Jewish life, and then came back to life. And we see it not only in Israel, but think of what the survivors brought to the United States. Think of it in the revival of Orthodoxy, the creation of recreation and rebirth of Hasidism, which had been completely decimated, and all the other elements of Jewish life. And then the great responsibility of the American Jewish community, which in 1945 was the only viable Jewish community that wasn't in danger of destruction, that had any degree of size, and that took responsibility for the whole of Jewish history at that moment in time. Israel was fighting for its life. Europe was decimated. Soviet Union was under oppression. And the only living Jewish community of any size was us. And lo and behold, this crazy Jewish community rose up to assume responsibility for the burden of Jewish history. And that's an achievement that some of you lived through, and certainly your parents lived through. and one of the great accomplishments of that generation.
Thank you. I think that's a really nice way to conclude the evening. And so yeah, thank you for such a thought-provoking lecture. And just as a continuation of this, just to give a little plug for our next program, we're going to have a program with Esther Safran Foer on her book this Wednesday at 12 o'clock. I know it's titled "I Want You to Know We're Still Here," a post-Holocaust memoir. So I think that might be a nice continuation of the narrative that is.
And Matthew, with all that I said, I neglected one more line, which I see here, which is, I knew Joshua Haberman, Rabbi Joshua Haberman. I respected and worked with Rabbi Joshua Haberman. And it's one of the great honors to participate in an institute that is founded in his name. He was an absolutely wonderful man, a terrific rabbi, and a deeply and profoundly learned and interested Jew. And I cherish his memory.
Yes. Yes.